So very good afternoon, everyone. First of all, on behalf of Centis Pharma, I really want to thank my eminent speakers and the moderator for the session. Also, this session is going to cover about glaucoma and dry eye therapy area, some of the controversial issues that our eminent speakers and moderators will be taking up in today afternoon. But before we proceed, I would like to actually share with you that what Centis is globally as well as in India. So allow me to share here a small video which will help you to understand what Centis is. Yeah. Is it visible, Surbhi?
No, ma'am.
No, Ruchi, you are playing on your computer only.
Okay, just a second.
Share the screen.
Yeah, I'll do. Just a second. Yeah, is it?
Yes, ma'am. Now we can.
So thank you very much, everyone, for having patience to see what Centis stands for. Let me invite here our eminent president and the founder of Centis Pharma, who is a man who has a very, very sweet, caring heart, as well as a visionary who has developed Centis Pharma from Russia and then CIS countries in India. So I would request Mr. Deepak Bahari to please speak a few words and invite Dr. Harsh Kumar and Dr. Kuresh Maskiti on the dais. Mr. Deepak Bahari, please.
Yes. Thank you, Ruchi, and welcome to all attendees, all doctors, and our esteemed panelists. It is always our endeavor to collect the best doctors to these webinars to give a really wide perspective to our attendees. Centis, as you saw in the slides, is an international company with an Indian heart. Our focus has always been on giving the best quality products to all patients in different parts of the world where we operate. As you may have seen in Russia, which is a large ophthalmic market, we are the second largest ophthalmic company after Alcon. In some markets, we are number one. In India, we were late entrants, so we are number 23. But as per the motto of our company, which is to give best quality on time, every time to our patients, and to give the highest quality products for the doctors to prescribe to their patients. Many of our products are back-free. As you may have seen, many are preservative-free. And that is our endeavor, to continue to give you the best quality products and the best support that we can. So I wish everybody a wonderful afternoon to enjoy the session with the eminent panelists. And I would request Dr. Harsh Kumar and Dr. Muscati to lead this sessions on glaucoma and dry eye. Thank you so much. Dr. Harsh Kumar, Dr. Paresh Muscati.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deepak, and thank you, Ruchi, and thank you, Syntest, for having us here. And Paresh, if you're okay, then we'll go ahead. Yeah, okay. So the idea is to give you some interesting cases and let you scratch your brain a little bit, because I know it's post lunch, you all tend to sleep, so we won't let you do that. And this is the first thing that I just want to share with you, that a 57-year male walks into us as our OPD, and he has got less vision in the left eye since childhood. Wearing glasses, no past history of eye problems. He actually never knew that he had this thing. His best character category was 6'6" and 6'18". Left eye had a cylinder over there. Rest of the things were normal, the pressure anterior segment. But what was interesting was the disc, and he had no clue about it. So you can see what a deep cupping with superior notch, and similarity with that, there is a inferior field loss. Similarly, we had a tilted disc in the left eye. Now this is the eye which had the less vision. And again, symmetrical to the inferior notch, you have a superior field defect. So it all fits into a beautiful case of glaucoma. Problem being that the pressures are in a nice diurnal variation done. The pressures are varying between 14 to 80. The corneal thickness is normal. So what exactly are we dealing with? Are we dealing with normal tension glaucoma? So we took a detailed history, whether the patient had at any time steroids, which would have damaged the nerve and then stopped it. Any history of trauma resulting in massive blood loss, which can result in something like this. Any CVS abnormality, because I've seen patients who had undergone a bypass ending up like this. No, there was no history of stroke or any other neurological problems. And we did a huge cage of investigations, including 24-hour BP recording, hemogram, ESR, lipid profile, carotid Doppler, MRI, you name it, we did it. And then we decided, all right, nothing is coming out, so we will put the patient on travoprost. And that we started and told the patient to come back after 3 months, so we'll see what's happening. Very nicely, as a lot of Indian patients do, he walks back after 26 months. But the field, the disc, everything was same. And I was very happy, and I whispered in my juniors' ears, "Dekho kitna acha treatment. The treatment is so good, everything is same." And then the patient quietly says, "Sir, but मैंने तो medicine 3 महीने बाद बंद कर दिया था. I have not used the medication." So it is really very tricky. So are we right in starting the treatment, or the patient was right in stopping the treatment? So how does it matter? Whether it is NTG or is it OAG, should we always treat? The problem is that NTG, everything is slightly different, because it is a diagnosis of exclusion. It is an unknown entity where IOP is not the major player. So there are other factors that we have to look for. And that is why we did all these investigations and sat down there and took the detailed history to try and figure out what it was. So the first confounding factor could be intraocular pressure. Is it that we are recording it wrongly or something like that? But we have done it very meticulously. There was a correct technique, corneal correction factors, yet all the IOPs were normal. What about the disc? Because if you have a bad disc, that bad disc will reflect in a bad field. And even if it is not glaucoma, you might think it is glaucomatous. So you have to be very, very careful about that. Are we dealing with a myopic patient? But it was not. Was it a disc coloboma? Was it a disc pit? Were there some retinal problems like BRVO, etc., which can again give you fields like that, or an ARMD? But we had checked that out. Sometimes even a pituitary tumor can give a compression, and rarely you can have not exactly like that, but you could have cups like that sometimes. Could it be an intermittent ECG? But we did our gonioscopy and we found out that nothing like that was existing. So we had to rule out all these problems, which we did. That is, nocturnal hypotension, perfusion pressure was not bad, cardiac decomposition was not there, there was no arrhythmias. All these things can reduce the blood flow to the eye and cause a damage, whereas the pressure may be normal. But we had to look it up. And like we already talked about this, out of which I think Posner, Schwarzman and Pigmenti were two things that we didn't talk about. So they can also give rise to this. So the NTG study had done, and what I really want to show is that 40% in this study were okay without treatment, and 40%, so that's a huge number, and 20% progress despite therapy. So NTG is a very, very tricky problem. So do we treat it? Risk of progression of visual fields is not related to the severity. But again, it can be related. It is not related also to age, hypertension, diabetes, or family history of glaucoma, but it may be related to migraine, disc hemorrhage in female, none of them happening in this case. Whom to treat is the important thing that we have to discuss. The cost is prohibitive because for poor patients in India, PGR analogs would be perhaps the best thing to do. But if the patient is poor, we may have to think of TRAB also because the pressures are so low. In this case, there was a thing which was threatening fixation. Okay, there's a field test which is right there, both the eyes. The IOP is in the higher ranges. There is a disc hemorrhage. There's a field deterioration. So, what are we looking at? Softer signs would be a wider diurnal variation, new optic disc hemorrhage, deep localized notch, younger age, systemic hypotension, vasospasm, myopia. So these are some of the things that we need to discuss. I think I'll stop sharing for some time and then we'll discuss. I think Manish, you can go ahead and let us know what would be your approach to such a patient. Would you have treated, were we right in treating, or were we wrong in starting treatment?
No, I completely agree that in this case, the two factors you pointed out, which mentioned that there was a little threat to fixation, number one, and number two, the pressures were on the higher range of the normal, higher side of the normal range. So these two factors do indicate that I would initiate treatment for this patient. Now, as you said, the studies also have shown, and we also see a lot of normal tensions don't progress. That's very good for us. But by not treating at this stage at the first time, I think would not be a correct decision. So I stand by your decision to start treatment. The point is that this is a very difficult situation where you go on investigating till you find something, and you have pointed out exhaustively almost everything that we generally look for. And just to be a little smarter, two more things I will add to that very big list. One is that sometimes vitamin deficiency, especially B12. And second is that I have had the experience of seeing patients who have had spine surgery. Spine surgery leads to hypotension, and I have seen patients developing CRAO in the hospital itself, and I have had patients who have followed up. Suddenly, I have seen them before not having field defects, not having anything. They undergo spine surgery and come back with a field defect. So I don't know what happens, but spine surgery is one history. I would add to your history of cardiovascular and everything. Please ask history of spine surgery.
Thank you very much. I'll add this to my slides later. And Prateep, so what are the patients of normal tension glaucoma which you would definitely not treat? You are muted, I think.
Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah.
So Harsh, when I looked at your disc, immediately, the disc was totally asymmetric. So God is a perfect architect. Whatever you have on the right side, you have very similar on the left side.
think the voice is breaking, Prateek.
left side and the right side. So it is uncommon. Is it okay?
Yeah, now it's better. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
It's okay.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So it's a very uncommon to have a tilted disc on the left side and the right side is the normal disc kind of appearance with normal refractive error. Refractive error is almost similar. When you look at the disc very carefully, on the left side there is an inferior conus. So obviously this inferior conus corresponds to the superior arcuate scotoma. It's a congenital anomaly, and there is in this anomaly there is an inferior nerve fiber layer loss. That is a known thing. When you look at the right side, the contour of the vessel is not following the cup. It is right emerging at the border of the cup, and there is some glial tissue also superiorly. So why not think of the disc anomaly and follow up the patient vertically? You know, anyway, patient has not put any draw for 2 years and he has not progressed.
Yeah, very good. So I
So-
think that's a very nice argument brought out.
So
That sometimes we think we are very intelligent, but the patient was more intelligent. And maybe if what Prateek is saying, we would have looked more closely, or possibly we could have done certain other things which would have told us that yes, this thing is not like. Okay, now let us say that it was a normal tension glaucoma. Manish, what would be your, and we are treating it, what would be your line of management in this situation?
Harsh, can you see the discs again?
Okay,
Not the glaucoma people,
yeah, I'll just share the thing again.
so that Prateep's
yeah, the normal
observations we
tension
can.
glaucoma people, they have a different characters on the disc. So those things are not visible in this disc.
Okay, this is the right. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah. So you see here,
Uh-huh.
this vessel is not following the contour of the cup.
Which
And
vessel?
this is not this vessel. This
This
is not
vessel.
emerging out. So there is a problem over here.
I completely disagree with Dr. Prateep. This vessel is the one which is bayoneting there.
There is a bayoneting here, na Prateek?
Yes, this is bayoneting. This is clear-cut glaucoma. There is no glial vial, nothing.
The edge over there.
So there is a disagreement between.
Look at here. What you
Observe
see
over
over
That's why
here.
we want to
The
wake up the
depth of
people.
the glial tissue. Huh?
We
Look at here.
glaucoma
This
specialists can never agree altogether.
no. The one thing you can do, Harsh, you can
Uh-huh.
definitely do this disc scan
Uh-huh.
on the OCT. And
Right.
you can see the disc contour. How the disc is, how deep the disc is over here, and how deep the disc over here.
Okay.
I would like to say that there is a very probably acquired pit also over there. See, the laminar
is-
dots are more easily visible over there than
Clearly,
down.
clearly.
So that is also one more sign which is there.
Yeah, that is, so it's quite
So
clear. Here
look
we
at
can
this.
yet see that there's some kind of an anomaly over there.
And this, look at here.
Yeah, this
So
is
this much of
definitely
asymmetry,
phenomenal.
you know, it is very, very rare to see in your practice. You know, we have seen hundreds of patients, and this kind of asymmetry, it's very rare to see.
Yeah,
The
it is
one
a rare-
eyes of
it is a
very
rare.
rare to see.
Yes.
Yes,
Classical
asymmetry
inferior
is
conus,
uncommon.
definitely you can correlate. Definitely you can correlate this one with the superior arcuate scotoma.
Yes.
So I would prefer to do this tomography before
Right.
advising any more investigation.
Okay.
And
Okay.
myself will sit on the OCT and will see what kind of contour of cup is there, how much is the glial tissue, what is the depth of cup
Right.
superiorly, what is the depth of cup inferiorly, and this really need to investigate properly.
Okay, but suppose we are not able to come to a conclusion. Let us forget that part, and let us say that we are treating. Okay, it's a case of NTG with those kind of field defects. So where will you start? We have given travoprost. Do you think that is right, or do you want to give some other kind of drug?
Oh, you are 100% right. You know, if we are not sure, then it is always better to treat the patient with so much of defect. And till I am 100% sure that it's a disc anomaly, then only I will stop the treatment. And as long as we have to treat the patient, we have to reduce the pressure at least by 30% from the baseline. The PG analog is the best choice of drug in these patients. There is no doubt
If
about it.
suppose PG analogs, the patient doesn't want to take or is reactive to it, what other medications will you try?
The second choice for me is the combination of brinzolamide and brimonidine for this patient.
And why
That
so?
will be my second.
Why so?
The simple reason is that I want to avoid the beta blocker. That is number one reason. And number two, brinzolamide and brimonidine are, at least theoretically, they have some additional role to play in the normal patient glaucoma.
Okay, yes, so that we want to increase the blood flow, whatever it is, because that it is
Yeah.
vascular,
Yeah.
it's a good idea to increase. And like Prateek very clearly explained, the beta blockers are something that we are not going to use. Manish,
number
would you like
two,
to use pilocarpine?
One more point I would like to tell you, Harsh, whenever you investigate this patient, put the Holter and see that how much dip in the blood pressure he has, right dip.
Yeah, that we have done. I already told you with the 24-hour BP recording we did, and we did all the other tests. We did the Holter also to rule out any arrhythmias, etc. So, Manish, would you like to give pilocarpine if nothing else is available?
Yes, in the normal tension glaucoma study, the CNTG, they have used pilocarpine also.
That is a very
And-
important point, that it is the cheapest drug available.
And this patient is not a myope. In myopes, I would
Yes.
like to avoid, but this
Very
patient is
good. I
not.
think I have already exhausted my 15 minutes. We must move on. And Manish, I would like you to share your cases.
So thank you, Dr. Harsh, and thank you, Sentis. And so I have got some cases also to share here. And so this is the first patient. Can you see the slides? And
Yeah.
am I audible?
Fine. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
So this is the, sorry, this is gone back. Okay. So this is the patient who is a 60-year-old male, and he came with complaints of heaviness and strain during dim light conditions. There was a positive family history of glaucoma and history of ischemic heart disease with cardiac arrhythmia. The vision was 6/6, N/6 in both eyes. Anterior segments were normal, but pressures were elevated. Right eye 28 and left eye 35. Bilateral appositional angle closure was there. Left eye was showing some areas of synechiae in 2 quadrants. So these were the optic disc appearances and the OCT findings, which corroborated that left eye, that even on the disc, you can see a superior temporal region. There is a notch and a bearing of the circumlinear vessel, and that is corresponding to a superior nerve fiber layer defect. Right eye more or less looks quite healthy and normal, and the OCT also is more or less okay, though I think some amount of NFL thinning could be seen. The visual fields corresponded, and you can see in the left eye corresponding to that superior notch, you can see a full inferior arcuate scotoma. So obviously this patient was confirmed to have glaucoma, and both eyes were YAG iridotomy was done. Post YAG right eye gonioscopy showed the angle opening sufficiently, but left eye there was one partial opening with the areas of synechiae continued to remain stuck. So prostaglandin analog was chosen as the first medical treatment, and the IOP with the right eye came down from 24/25 to 14/17. Left eye, which was 35, came down to 24/28. That which is more or less expected with prostaglandin. One drug, I don't think from 35, even after iridotomy, because synechiae were there, I did not expect it to come down to target levels. But patient has arrhythmia and cardiac problems. So we decided to avoid the beta blocker, and we added dorzolamide, with which the pressure came down to 20/25, which also was not sufficient considering the damage. And brimonidine, lo and behold, the patient was not tolerating, got severe itching and red eye and follicles. So we had to choose. Now what are we going to do? Are we going to add pilocarpine? Now I have not commented about the refractive status, but it was almost emmetropic. It didn't have much of a refractive error. Can we use pilocarpine or the newer drugs which have come, the ROCK2 inhibitors? Because that is also an option we can add. Or, you know what, everybody is interested nowadays. Let's go and remove the cataract first. And laser iridoplasty, famous Dr. Harsh Kumar is the big proponent of that. So that is one thing which we could have done. But when there is synechiae already there, I don't think laser iridoplasty is really going to do much in this scenario. And of course, the standard age-old, which really delivers results in most our cases, is doing a trabeculectomy. So I would like to ask my friends for what they go for pilocarpine. Today's day and age, when you write pilocarpine, even many times I've had the complaint that patient will call and say, sir, this is not available. Then you have to tell him to search around little. Finally, they get it. But pilocarpine usage is dropping in the market like anything. So are we going to use pilocarpine, or would we prefer to try the newer ROCK inhibitor? So what would you like to do, Dr. Pradeep?
Yeah, Manish, again, regarding this patient, I would like to differ a bit. I personally feel that, this patient does not have a 360-degree synechitis. That is what you have
No,
mentioned.
360-degree synechitis is not
No.
there. I confirm that. It is
Oh,
only
yeah, you confirmed that. You said
Yeah,
that he
yeah.
does not have it. That is what
Yeah.
I'm telling. He does not have a 360-degree synechitis. You did the PI. Probably you have opened little bit more of an angle. Okay. But still his pressure has not gone down significantly. Number one. Number two, you started him on the PG analog. And then you got the reduction in the IOP of around 30% from the baseline in both the eyes. So when you look at the disc again, I'm going off the track. When you look at the disc again, you see a significant amount of the parapapillary atrophy and alpha and beta zone. Remember one thing, in the angle closure glaucoma, you never see this kind of a classical parapapillary atrophy. So I would say that, probably this patient has a mixed mechanism glaucoma. So if the patient has a mixed mechanism glaucoma, then you have to be a little more aggressive because they behave very abnormally. And as far as, if you want to add some other drug, then obviously the ROCK inhibitor, whether it's a Rivaroxaban or Nitazoxanide, in my personal experience, at least the biosimilar molecule is non-inferior to beta blocker. They will bring down the intraocular pressure as an add-on therapy by around 2 to 3 millimeter of mercury, not more than that. So that would not help. Even if you will put this patient on the pilocarpine, the synechitis, the pilocarpine will not be able to open. So it will not be that effective. If the patient is a 60-year-old, if he has some amount of cataract, it is the best option to go for the combined surgery because you have put two options. Number one is a clear lens, and another with micromesis C. So why not both combine together, the trabeculectomy along with the cataract extraction? If he does not have a cataract, then he is the right candidate, at least for the left eye, to go for the trabeculectomy with micromesis C.
Okay, what I feel is that I don't know, Pradeep, why to you a mixed mechanism would be more dangerous. To me, the fact that it is an angle closure glaucoma itself means that the chances of blindness are 3 times more than in open angle glaucoma. So even if there was a component of open angle glaucoma, that doesn't mean that it will increase the chances of its blindness, because the chances of blindness in this case of angle closure per se are much higher. So if there's any other component, it doesn't add to its severity per se. And as far as the treatment part is concerned, definitely patients are not comfortable with pilocarpine. Most of the times they cannot get pilocarpine, but it is not a bad treatment for poor people if they don't want a surgery. If they don't want a surgery and there's a clear lens and the vision doesn't go down, many a times pilocarpine can bring it down significantly. But then depends upon how many drugs are you going to add over there. So in the end, I have learned this with gross mistakes on my part at times, that if you leave some of these patients, they will go away. When they come back, the left eye will be PL negative because they have not found the drugs, this thing and that thing has happened. So I think what Pradeep said was right, that I think we should go ahead and do a trabeculectomy. If he has got a cataract, we can think of doing a combined, but at least a trabeculectomy is a must.
I just want to ask one more question. Is that pilocarpine, I know that we are not in very much in favor of using it just now, but when in combination with prostaglandin, do you think we can use pilocarpine?
Yeah.
Yeah, it
It
does
works better.
Practically, it works, yes.
Because there are some experts in this conference itself, I have heard people saying that you should not.
Yeah. Theoretically, they will say that, but practically it does.
It opens a more ciliary phase. So
Yeah.
obviously for prostaglandin, it's more space to work.
I think, Manish, you have another case?
Yes, so this is a 64-year-old.
Let's
So
go.
this is a short case. A 64-year-old male reports for routine examination, well-controlled diabetic, but not hypertensive. Vision of both eyes 6/6 and 6. Again, pressure in right eye 26, left eye 24. Gonioscopy open. Field and disc I'm going to show you. Corneal thickness was not remarkable. The fields showed right eye having a proper superior defect, which was quite close to fixation. Left eye showing a nasal step kind of thing. Here also you can see the discs. These are all abnormally shaped discs, but there are defects seen and pressures are high, and it is matching what we see on the visual field. So initiation of medical therapy was done with latanoprost single drop. But the patient was called back after 2 to 3 weeks. But patient doesn't wait. He comes back with severe complaints, foreign body sensation, redness, fluctuating vision, extremely uncomfortable. And lo and behold, it is quite bad. You get the SPK and patient is severely red eye and you are really upset. This is going to definitely affect the quality of vision as well. So here you have that immediately after starting, we have developed this effect. Probably I am supposing that I had missed seeing the pre-existing ocular surface disease in my rush to control the intraocular pressure, which I think I did not examine the patient that carefully, because when I saw high pressures and field defects, I jumped at putting some drops and getting the thing down. But now this has happened, so we know that using these drops are not going to be safe for the patient. So do we go for preservative-free medications? Is that a good option in such a scenario? Or do we go directly for non-medical treatment like the SLT or the newer MIGS and non-penetrating glaucoma surgeries, or the traditional trabeculectomy operations? So in this case, I immediately withdrew the drug and put the patient on Diamox, because I did not want to start anything else, and gave ocular lubricants, hot compresses, and then now you get those lid wipes also to clean the eyelids. And obviously the drops which I gave, the lubricants, were free of BAK and preservative free, and patient improved. Following that, I started the patient on prostaglandin in Novelia bottle kind of thing, so that it was less preservative, and patient did well with that. But this is open for discussion right now.
Okay, Pradeep, go ahead.
Yeah, we will sit for the second half and we will listen
I
to the
think we
corner
can
people.
discuss the same things over there, because we are getting short of time. I think the approach was absolutely right, that we have to stop the medication, start Diamox, get the pressure under control, and then move on and try and introduce one drug at a time, because the totally preservative free will be very expensive. But then we can try semi-preservative free drugs of Centis Pharma also. So I think so we can discuss that in the dry eye section. Pradeep, you go ahead with your case first.
Yeah. So can you see my screen?
Right now we only see you.
Huh? Just a minute. I'm not seeing.
Yes. Now we.
Open the case.
A minute. Is it coming? Is there?
Okay, go ahead.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I will present my first case. This is a 14-year-old girl. I saw this girl almost about 25 years before when I was in Ganpati Netralaya. There was no family history of glaucoma, and her vision was 6/6 and 6 in both the eyes, and slit lamp examination otherwise was within normal limit. And I performed the gonioscopy. I did not see any goniodysgenesis in any of the eye or any abnormality in the angle. The intraocular pressure measured was 24 and 27 millimeter of mercury, and the central corneal thickness was almost normal. Unless there was obviously no pathology. So this was the right eye disc and this was the left eye disc. Obviously, the size is little bigger, but when you see the left eye disc carefully, you would realize that yes, there is a significant amount of the cup is large in both the eyes, but here the neuroretinal rim is perfectly healthy. Here there is a significant pillar from here to here. The 14 years old girl with a significant pillar, obviously, I did the perimetry for this girl. The right eye was normal. The left eye was the inferior orchid scotoma, which was obviously correlating with the disc finding. And obviously it was not neurological. So I put her on the beta blocker twice a day in both the eyes because the pressure was abnormal in the right eye as well. And 2 years later, the pressure was around 22, 24 millimeter of mercury in both the eyes. I did the perimetry again, and left eye, it progressed significantly. So I advised the PG analog in the left eye, and she continued the PG analog for a pretty long time, and I followed her for almost 3-4 years to her, and her glaucoma was not progressing. But then subsequently, she underwent a trabeculectomy in both the eyes, and she did her medical education, she did the ophthalmology, and she did the glaucoma fellowship from Arvind, and she is now somewhere. I don't want to disclose. You would come across with her sometime. But the first point which I would like to ask that when I was not able to see the goniodysogenesis, did I miss, or you can say that there is some abnormality in the posterior trabeculum as well. So obviously you cannot see through the gonioscopy, but because of that, it was a developmental glaucoma. That was question number one. Question number two, obviously, when I started her on a PG analog, a young girl with lots of periorbital pigmentation and hypertrichosis, she was not at all comfortable. So it is the point to be discussed because most of these patients over a period of time develop significant amount of prostaglandin associated periorbitopathy, and they come with lots of cosmetic side effects. So these are the two things which probably, I would like to discuss with you people, that at the first place, I would have done the surgery for her and to prevent her from the progression, or what would you suggest?
I think your initial approach was right because it's very difficult to just go ahead and do the surgery to begin with. And but if the patient had told you right initially that yes, there is a development of hypertrichosis and she is uncomfortable, I think some of these young patients, they really do well on surgery. So since lifelong medications starting from that very age is bound to give side effects and mental this thing and financial cost problems, one probably can think of surgery also. Manish?
So I definitely think that we have to have a bias towards early surgery in younger patients, because the young patient you want to treat very aggressively, and actually you started the treatment and with beta blocker and you got pressures only in 20s, if I am not mistaken. Did I get wrong?
Yeah,
I would not have been satisfied there itself. I would have wanted pressures to come down closer below 18 at least. So I would like to treat aggressively, that is fixed. Now I know that this PG analogs are very good for older people, but for young people, and especially fair-skinned people, it is terrible because it produces so much of signs on the cosmetic changes, and young people are not going to accept this very well, and the relatives also are not willing to accept. So I would definitely think of trying to put on other drops and then go for early surgery rather than use too much of prostaglandins. Definitely. And one more point I would like to see is, once I would, in that left eye, probably I would have given a trial of SLT. I know SLT is not the best treatment for juvenile glaucomas or developmental glaucomas, but there is no harm in trying. There's no flip side. If you are willing to try prostaglandins, which are going to cause so much of side effects, why not try SLT also? I would have given a try.
Yeah,
Because
it was way back in 1998, and at that time the PG analog was very new, so we were very excited to give the PG analog. That was number one. Number two, yes, we did have the SLT in way back in 1999 and 2000 for a trial. But the problem was that, there was one thing in our mind that she might be having a goniogenesis. And if it's a goniogenesis, then the SLT
It's
will
not going to work.
not work. Then I did the follow for this girl till I was there, and then surgery was done by the consultant there itself. So, but she was in touch with me, and when she got admitted in medical college, she did contact me. And when she entered in ophthalmology, at that time also she contacted me. And when she joined the glaucoma fellowship, at that time also she contacted. Now she
I
is
have
married.
one-
Well.
Can we move
I
on
have
to the
one-
next
one-
case? Because I
You
think-
want to go ahead with your next case? There's one more question I want to ask. Do you check IOP in every 14-year-old who comes to you in the OPD?
No, because she was a disc suspect, so that's why I checked the IOP.
Okay, it was a disrespect. Fine.
So this is again, the second is again a known case, a good friend of mine, a neurosurgeon by profession, 50-year-old, hypertensive for 5 years, came to me with a complaint of occasional headache. And obviously coming to me was for the second opinion because he was diagnosed to have a glaucoma by some other ophthalmologist. His vision was 20/20, the pressure was 20 and 22. Corneal thickness was normal. Gonioscopy was wide open angle. And obviously I look for every possible things which may cause the glaucoma, like PDS and past uveitis and history of steroid use or abuse and pseudoexfoliation and so on and so forth. But everything was negative. The fundus was normal. The OCT and perimetry was advised, and this was the first picture of the disc, and you can see that there is slight vertical enlargement of the cup on the left side. But we did the OCT, and the OCT was absolutely normal, and on deviation web growth there was this little bit of defect, but superpixel coded image was absolutely normal. We did the perimetry, and the perimetry was normal because he was my good friend. So I continued to do OCT and the perimetry very frequently. And then he was also became quite confident, and he lost for follow-up because he said that, he doesn't have a glaucoma, though he was labeled as a suspect. But one fine day when he came to me, I did the OCT for him, and I saw that there is a little changes. And when you see the segmental image, you can see that there is a little RNFL loss over here. And in the superpixel coded image also, there was a yellow discoloration. And when I saw the disc, there was a RNFL defect on the inferotemporal side, perimetry, and there was a little bit of superior arcuate scotoma. So obviously, we started the treatment, and after that, he became conscious, and every time he used to say that, whenever I operate on the microscope, sometimes, I miss something superiorly, so I am uncomfortable. But probably it is more related to because he has become more conscious. But my question to you is that, this was the time when I would have started the treatment after looking at this, which was very looking like a glaucomatous disc and not dependent on the OCT and the perimetry. And if yes, then what treatment I would have started at that time?
Was there a family?
No.
Sorry, I missed Pradeep.
No family history of glaucoma.
And what was the thickness, corneal thickness?
Normal, 520 approximately.
So you can't dream of that with everything normal. It's very, very tough. So really,
So
only
yeah,
thing-
it was a very tough call. Looking at here, initially I thought that I should have started treatment.
so what was
But
the gap?
obviously,
What was the gap between this?
no, it was in Pavitra Netralaya, and this was in our CFS.
So means the
So obviously there was a gap of almost 2 to 3 years.
2-3 years. Yeah.
Yeah, he was lost for follow-up in
So
between.
I see that this is a classical case where the central field has to be checked even in early glaucoma.
Absolutely. So here your 24 days to C comes our central 10 days to 2.
10-2, yeah.
Hmm.
So, I always have a guilt. Whenever I meet him, I always have a guilt that, whether, because of now everything is stable, and it's almost 3 years now. The fields are not progressing. His pressure is 14. There is little bit of hypertrichosis and hyperpigmentation, but he's tolerating well. And the another thing, I want to bring out this, I never did the diurnal variation. No one has raised this point. I never did the diurnal variation. So there is, the utility of diurnal variation. And I would like to bring out one point over here. If you cannot do the diurnal variation, then the water drinking test is good. At least it tells you the peak. What is the peak intraocular pressure? Ask the patient to drink 1 liter of water and check the intraocular pressure after half an hour, 1 hour, maybe. So you would come to know the peak. So that is the thing probably which I might have missed. So, and obviously, close friends. So every time you don't dilate and you don't do the detailed examination because he's in hurry, you are in hurry. So there are a couple of messages that, always think that every patient is the same patient, whether he is a minister or IAS or a good friend or a family member. Then do the detailed examination. Number 2, I think I have missed the 24 hours IUP check, the diurnal variation. And if there was no time, then at least I would have done the water drinking test. All these old age tests, they have some value still in the present era. So that is what, couple of points I would like to.
And yes,
comment.
definitely what Manish was saying. I think now we should start doing 10-2 in such patients. Because
Absolutely.
the 24C2 program may not be available to most of us. So I think we should add this on, that wherever we are suspicious, we should go ahead and do a 10-2. So I think these are very good take-home points from this. And I think we can hand over to Quresh. And Quresh, can you just discuss a little bit about the case that Manish showed us? The first case that Manish showed us.
Yeah. We will. So I'll just first introduce my team. Thank you, Harsh, and the glaucoma people. This being a combined glaucoma and dry eye meeting, we now have the dry eye segment where we've got a team of interesting speakers to take you right from the basic examination techniques to investigations to treatment to newer treatment besides and beyond lubricants. So let's, Harsh, take it up when we're talking about the treatment, and then we'll cover it extensively at that time. Yeah.
Okay.
So don't go away. This is too.
No, I have to because I have another meeting, but I'll check up with Prateek.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
So we'll start with the first speaker, Dr. Hijab Mehta, on basics of examination in dry eye.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Senthis. It is a very basic talk on evaluation of dry eye. Whatever the etiology of dry eye, the symptoms are fairly common: discomfort, dryness, burning, foreign body sensation, photophobia, fluctuating vision. It is very important to take a good medical history to know any underlying autoimmune disorders such as Sjogren's, rheumatoid, SLE, thyroid disease, ocular history, including that of surgeries, contact lens usage, systemic medications like antihistamines, antidepressants, anxiolytics. All of them cause dryness. Ocular medication, especially glaucoma medication, because they do cause a pseudopemphigoid-like appearance. Presence of allergies, there's presenting complaints, and history of also ocular treatment of dry eye. Then there are a number of risk factors of dry eye disease. Some of them I've mentioned earlier. And we all know broadly we have 2 types, the aqueous deficient dry eye and the evaporative dry eye. And there is a host of etiologies for both of them. Whatever the etiology, whether aqueous deficient or evaporative, there is basically an increased tear hyperosmolarity, which along with the cytokines causes a damage to the ocular surface epithelium, goblet cells, causes tear film instability, and that further accentuates the hyperosmolarity and sets in a vicious cycle. To grade the dry eye symptoms, you have a number of questionnaires. One of them is the Ocular Surface Disease Index questionnaire, which is simple, easy. It measures the frequency of the dry eye symptoms, the environmental triggers, and the vision-related disturbances it causes the patient. And it can grade the severity from mild to severe. We need to start with a visual acuity examination to differentiate asthenopic symptoms from the dry eye symptoms. Look at the facial skin to look for rosacea, deformities of the hands as in rheumatoid arthritis. Look for entropion, ectropion, lag ophthalmos. Look for dystichiasis, trichiasis, blepharitis. Then look at the meibomian gland orifices, the dropout, the ease of meibum expression, the orifice patency, the nature of the meibomian gland secretions helps us to classify the grade of the meibomitis. Then look at the inferior tier meniscus. Normal height is 0.1 to 0.3. Anything less than that is indicative of aqueous deficiency, dry eye. Look for the completeness of the lid closure, the blinks per minute. Whenever the skin around the eyes is affected, hyperpigmented, dry, scaly, this goes in favor of atopy and atopic keratoconjunctivitis. Look at the bulbar congestion. Superior bulbar congestion goes in points towards superior limbic keratoconjunctivitis. Presence of filaments is also an indicator of ocular surface dryness along with inflammation. This was a patient with primary Sjogren's, typically history of dry eyes and dry mouth with severe superficial punctate keratopathy, both the eyes. Then look for the presence of papillae. If you have giant papillae, you know it is allergy that you're dealing with. Fine papillae can be seen in keratoconjunctivitis sicca. Look at the presence of subepithelial fibrosis. It's a pointer towards cicatricial conjunctivitis. For example, here in this patient with ocular cicatricial pemphigoid, you can see fornitional shortening. Then also the morphology of the epithelium. If there are these walls or these different patterns of the epithelium, it is an indicator of epithelial stress and stem cell exhaustion. You know, you normally see these patterns in patients who are putting a number of glaucoma medications as well. The presence of lid margin keratinization is a pointer towards Stevens-Johnson syndrome. Presence of this confluent patch of unhealthy epithelium inferiorly goes in favor of drug toxicity. This patient was on multiple glaucoma medications, and probably this can occur also in exposure keratopathy. Look for the presence of lid parallel conjunctival folds. Their presence is a positive predictive sign of dry eye disease. There is some damage to the conjunctival stroma, probably induced by the matrix metalloproteinases. It could be an early stage of conjunctivochalasis. However, they are much smaller in cross section. They do not occur centrally and they are not related to age. The most common clinically done tests are the Schirmer's test 1 and 2, though we don't do the 2 in clinical practice so often. All of us do Schirmer's test 1 with or without anesthesia. The Schirmer's strip is usually placed at the junction of the lateral 1/3, medial 2/3. You can ask the patient to blink normally or keep the eyes closed. Do it in the same conditions each time. A wetting of less than 10 millimeters suggests abnormality. Schirmer's 2, you can place the strip similarly and you irritate the nasal mucosa with a swab and assess the secretion of assess the wetting of the Schirmer's strip. Schirmer's test 1 measures the response of the lacrimal gland to surface irritation. There's a reduced response due to lacrimal gland disease, decreased ocular surface sensitivity and disruption of the afferent supply to the midbrain. Test 2 measures if the abnormalities at the level of the ocular surface or in the lacrimal gland. If both the test 1 and test 2 are abnormal, that means problem is in the lacrimal gland. If the Schirmer's test 2 wetting is better than 1, then the problem is on the ocular surface. Then we have tests for ocular surface integrity. One of them is fluorescein staining. It basically stains the areas of epithelial breakdown, best seen in blue light. Then we have Lissamine green, where more dye is released, so it will stain even eyes which are very dry. It stains the dead and degenerated cells and best seen with the white light and red filter. Rose Bengal is toxic, irritating to the ocular surface. It stains the surface cells due to lack of protective mucin barrier. It can stain the healthy as well as degenerated cells, best seen in white light with green barrier. Then the staining can be graded using different grading systems. One of them is the Oxford grading system, where you compare the patient's ocular surface staining to the panel given on the left side. You have the National Eye Institute grading system, where you divide the cornea into 5 areas. Each is graded on a scale of 0 to 3. A score more than 3 is abnormal. Similarly, you do to the bulbar conjunctiva. And a score of more than 3 is abnormal. Then the staining pattern also helps us to know the underlying disease. If there is diffuse staining, you know it is severe dry eye. Moderate amount of staining is moderate dry eye. If there is inferior staining, you know it's due to blepharitis or exposure. Then 3 or 9 o'clock staining is typically due to contact lens wear. Superior staining, as I mentioned earlier, is superior limbic keratoconjunctivitis. Then we have the fluorescein breakup time, the first appearance of the dry spot after eyelid opening. Normal is 10 seconds or more. Anything less than 5 seconds is indicative of dryness, but fluorescein itself reduces the tear film stability. So we have the non-invasive breakup time measured without fluorescein. The technique involves the observation of the specular reflection of an illuminated grid from the tear film. You have a number of topographers which can give you the non-invasive breakup time. I have the series which can non-invasively measure the breakup time. Anything less than 10 seconds indicates dryness. Our topographer can also do a micrography, which the next speaker will speak about. Then we can look at the corneal sensations using a wisp of cotton wool, compare the sensation between the two eyes. We can also use the Cochet-Bonnet aesthesiometer if you have access to one. And this helps in diagnosing viral keratitis. This was a patient who came to us with a persistent epithelial defect and reduced corneal sensations. We thought it is neurotrophic keratopathy secondary to viral affection, but he also complained of reduced sensations on the same side of the face. So I got a neurology reference done, and incidentally it turned out that he was a case of leprosy which had recurred. Then this is a case, a young healthy male who had undergone LASIK surgery, previous contact lens wearer, age was 39, and came with severe dry eyes 3 months post-surgery, eventually responded to lubricants and punctal plugs. So the basic dry eye tests also help us to differentiate whether it is aqueous deficiency, evaporated dry eye, or mucin deficiency. If you, for example, a Schirmer's of less than 10, a tear meniscus height of less than 0.3, and diffuse staining means there is aqueous deficiency. You see anterior posterior blepharitis, tear film breakup time less than 10, you know it is evaporative deficiency. And if you see conjunctival scarring and a breakup time of less than 10, it is mucosal mucin deficiency. Then you have this new perspective on dry eye proposed by the Asia Dry Eye Society, where in addition to the aqueous deficiency, evaporative dry eye, there is this decreased wettability dry eye because of the deficiency of membrane associated mucins. That is the epithelial glycocalyx, the protective glycocalyx is compromised. And if you look at the fluorescein breakup pattern in the patients carefully, you can differentiate between the 3 different types of dry eye. So if you have an area break, or if you have a line break, that means it's aqueous deficient. If you have spot break or you have a dimple break, that means it is decreased wettability. If you have random breaks, meaning it is lipid deficiency. This is what they call tear film oriented diagnosis, or TFOD, to propose a tear film oriented therapy where you target the deficient component. So to conclude, there is no definite gold standard test for dry eye. Basically, it is a combination of the symptomatology and any one of the homeostasis markers. So when you do the tests, it's better to start with the non-invasive breakup time, do the tear osmolarity if you have access to it, do the Schirmer's, do the fluorescein breakup time, and the staining in that order. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hijab. And taking off from where Hijab left off to tell us about the investigations that we would do in dry eye, we have Dr. Hitendra Ahuja.
Are my slides visible, sir?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you, Sentis, and thank you, Dr. Quresh, for having me. And I'll be speaking on your investigation in dry eye for next few minutes. As explained by Dr. Hijab about the tear film oriented dry eye diagnosis, the core mechanism of dry eye, according to the recent consensus in Asia, in Asian Dry Eye Society, is tear film instability. And when we are trying to find a cause in between these layers to say what is deficit, and it is known as tear film oriented diagnosis, or TFOD. And if we classify these investigations, what we are going to perform for dry eye, we broadly have classified into tear film volume assessment, tear film stability, ocular surface status, or the measurement of the visual disturbance. And we will take it one by one. This is a newer way to test measurement of tear volume at the tear meniscus, and it is done by anterior segment OCT, and the cutoff value for this is 0.3 mm. This test is highly reproducible, non-invasive, and It has a significant correlation with the Sharma 1 as proved in literature, and it has a sensitivity of 67% and the specificity of 81%. And another thing to study this volume, there is a strip meniscometry, and it measures the amount of tears, and cutoff is 4 mm. It also has a good sensitivity and specificity. Basically, it has a polyurethane backing and it has a tear absorber non-woven fabric, and it doesn't really touch the conjunctiva and test the uh, tear volume. And if you have some more money to spend, you can have this expensive instruments like Oculus keratograph, which will give you a lot of information. It can measure up to hundredth of millimeter along the meniscus about the tear film volume, and it has also a program into which the questionnaire, OSDI questionnaire, tear osmolarity, blink rate, or all these things can be incorporated in a report, and a customized report about the dry eye can be made and discussed with the patient. And the on the follow up, the what how the treatment has helped him can be discussed with the patient. And this was discussed by Dr. Hijab. This is a new concept being promoted by a Japanese group, which tells us that the area break, the spot break, line break, or the dimple break tells us that there is a deficit in the aqueous. And if it is a random break, it tells that it is a evaporative dry eye. If we are studying this on a routine slit lamp, this can be done on that. And if we but these keratographs have a software to capture this, to observe, document in grade staining pattern, and also further how the treatment, how the drops are helping can be studied and discussed with the patient. But if we don't want to use any fluorescein, now there are this tear film stability analysis system, TSAS, and here we don't have to use fluorescein and screen a dry eye. And this is what will happen over a period of time. Very quickly, the irregular astigmatism will increase in such patients, the surface irregularity index will change, and the surface asymmetry index will change. These are some of the parameters which are studied in this tear film stability analysis system. And not only this newer gadgets, the keratograph can also give us precise breakup mapping and time measurement without the use of fluorescein, which has certain drawbacks. And if we are now aiming to test the tear film stability, LipiView is a good diagnostic tool. It will tell us the health of the lipid film, and if we are and also can give information on how much meibomian glands are working, how much is the dropout, and this can be very nicely discussed with the patient and further managed. Now, a concept, a word about tear film osmolarity. As we all know that tear film osmolarity basically tells us the uh, 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 balance between the production, the evaporation, and drainage, the absorption of the tear film. So it's a very important tool. It's a very important information which can tell about the status of the dry eye. And the various ways to study this are device using electrical impedance to measure tear film osmolarity, vapor pressure concept, and freezing pressure osmometer. We will not be going into the detail, but the most commonly what is used are the devices using electrical impedance, and the devices are the tear lab or the eye pen, which are being used. And this is how this tear osmolarity is tested, and a value of 308 osmol per liter is the cutoff. And if we have a value more than this, then there is definitely the tear film is unstable and patient has a dry eye. So before we kind of complete. I think biomarkers should be discussed. The high patient with early dry eye characteristically have lower protein content compared with patient who do not have dry eye, and high levels of inflammatory biomarkers like matrix metalloprotein 9 may lead to early diagnosis of dry eye. And there are various ways of doing it, like this instrument. And the other ways to do it are tear scan, micro assay system, iPrim, and SJO. And to study the cell, now the impression cytology, we have a replacement, the newer technique of confocal microscopy, which can give us the what's the quality of the cell, the phenotypic alteration in the in Sjogren patients or any other patients where we want to study. It can also even give us there is a research going on which will tell us the condition of the lacrimal gland even. And this new concept of functional visual acuity, basically what they are trying to tell is visual acuity by forced eye opening was measured under topical anesthesia, and it was named as functional visual acuity, whereas the conventional visual acuity represents the highest vision at a given examination time. And what are the advantages? The advantages are diagnosis and screening of the dry eye, judging the treatment effect. How this is done? This is the instrument by which it is done. Landolt ring type prototype is optotype is shown to the patient. If the response is correct, then there is no problem. If it is incorrect, the size is increased, and this is and with time, what happens is there are bigger changes noted in patients of dry eye over a short span of 60 seconds. So this is what I had to tell you about the newer investigation in dry eye. Thank you.
Quite fascinating, Hitendra. Some of these things were new to all of us as well. And let us see how many of them stand the test of time and become standard armamentarium in our hands. We move on now to treatment of dry eye. Now that we have diagnosed it, investigated it, let's hear from Paras the standard treatment techniques or standard treatments that we use for dry eye. Then we'll have Sujata telling us the newer things besides lubricants. Yes, Paras.
Thank you. At the outset, I would like to thank Scientist Pharma AIOS and Dr. Maskati for giving me this opportunity. Can you see my slides and hear me?
Both perfect.
Yeah, fine. So, like, my topic is a little more theoretical, choosing an ideal lubricant. We all know that tear supplements or lubricants are the mainstay of therapy for dry eye disease, despite all the innovations in the understanding of the pathophysiology and insight into the diagnosis and documenting the dry eye. The artificial tears provide an immediate, most affordable, and least invasive form of treatment. So it remains still the mainstay, despite all the other agents. So here, because I'm going to focus on lubricants, the talk is more focused on that area only. But the facts are there is a dearth of randomized controlled trials that compare the efficacy of commercially available artificial tears. The FDA has approved, the FDA approval process for artificial tears does not require individual study submissions, and much of the available research is industry funded, which can further complicate drawing clinically applicable evidence. One of the recent meta-analysis reviewed quite a significant, did a head-to-head artificial tear trial, and they came to a conclusion that it is unclear whether some artificial tears are better than others at relieving patients' symptoms, though they did relieve the symptoms in patients who used artificial tears. So the question here is, do we have an ideal tear substitute available, despite so many things available into the market? Ideally, one should have a preservative-free, that means less epitheliotoxic drug available. It should be soothing to the ocular surface, should have good retention time on the surface, but should not at the same time blur the vision, should have all the elements a natural tear can provide. Do we have one? Not yet. So let's look at the properties like, the artificial tears mainly are lubricants. The active ingredient is polymeric base or viscosity agent. And the tear supplements should be preservative free, should have the electrolytes as mentioned here. And the key elements would be preservatives, electrolyte composition, osmolarity, and viscosity agents. The primary active ingredients found in most of the artificial tears are either ophthalmic demulcents or emollients. These demulcents are substances that soothe the mucous membranes, and in case of artificial tears, they provide lubrication in the form of mucoprotective film, and they can alleviate discomfort, aid in water retention, and decrease friction across the ocular surface. So based on that, FDA has approved demulcents for artificial tears. This chart depicts the active ingredients in various formulations, the concentration of it which is available, and the functions which it provides to the ocular surface. If you look at the types of ingredients which are present in artificial tears, there could be viscosity enhancing agents like CMC, HA, combination of CMC plus hyaluronic acid, or HP guar, or combination of HP guar and hyaluronic acid and HPMC. There could be osmotic agents, osmoprotectants like L-carnitine and betanin and trehalose. The lipid supplements which are not available currently in India, the preservatives like they could have bark or other preservatives which are, transiently present or disappearing preservatives. There could be inactive components and antioxidants. Based on this table, we would understand that the preservatives would have this kind of a role, as the previous speakers in the glaucoma session were worried about the presence of benzalkonium chloride or BAC on the surface as the patient is on long-term anti-glaucoma medications. So we would be worried about the patients who would be having preservatives into their even tear supplements, and they are on multi-drug therapy due to other reasons. The electrolyte composition should be also balanced. The osmolarity, again, as was mentioned in Dr. Ahuja's talk, that, we should be having tears which would decrease the osmolarity to break the vicious circle, and the viscosity agents which are available to us. So it is ideal to use drops which are preservative free for everybody, which are available in unit dose, but cost is an issue. So probably we can use transiently preserved artificial tears where the preservative disappears on contact with the air, like SOC or perborate. Or one can have Novelia bottle technology or dispensers which can have totally non-preserved tears. Or in conditions where artificial tears are used for a short period of time and in lesser frequency, maybe we can use any combination, like, we can use PEG, or any kind of, lubricant can be used if it is being used for a very short period of time, like maybe for computer vision syndrome or for post-cataract surgery for a very short while, or maybe for a post-LASIK surgery also for a very short while, or in cases where grade 1 dry eye is there, or in step 1 management. Let's look at the role of active ingredients. Interestingly, as per DEWS, they've mentioned almost all the compounds which are available in the Indian markets, like CMC, it means sodium hyaluronate, PEG and PG, HP guar, HPMC, trehalose, but there is no mention that any of these is superior to the others. None of the studies have proven that. Let's look at the mechanism of action of each of them quickly, and then maybe we will come back to the our main question. Why PEG, PG with HP guar? This, once it comes in contact with the ocular surface, its viscosity increases, and the solution turns into a protective film, which provides immediate relief and long-term improvement of symptoms. So, which can be used for grade 1 dry eye, or even for patients who have evaporative dry eye to begin with, or any transient, short-term management of dry eye. In aqueous deficient dry eye, the preference would be CMC lubricants as a first choice, because they are superior. They provide superior symptomatic relief. They have superior mucoadhesive force. They have superior regeneration. They cause superior regeneration of the goblet cells and recovery of the ocular surface health. It is available in 0.5 and 1% concentration. 1% sometimes causes blurring and sometimes cracking at the lid margins. And in studies which have done, CMC has the highest mucoadhesive force to hydrate the cells. So maybe for moderate to severe dry eye, maybe CMC should be a first choice. or if given in a given situation, if you have no other problems, one can even use it in grade 1 dry eye. In addition to CMC, one can add osmoprotectants like, tear hyperosmolarity is the central mechanism in the pathogenesis of ocular surface damage, and it is associated with inflammation in the dry eye. So more recent attempts to counteract tear hyperosmolarity in dry eye disease have included these osmoprotectants into the management part. The osmoprotectants protect cells under extreme osmotic stress by balancing the osmotic pressure without disturbing the cell metabolism. They restore cell volume and stabilize protein function, allowing adaptation of hyperosmolarity. As you can see here, sodium hyaluronate would be a good alternative. It creates a water bridge is formed between the amine and carboxyl groups, which is present in hyaluronate and the water molecule. So essentially, it has two basic properties, biophysical properties and biochemical properties. The biophysical properties would help in higher water retention, right viscosity, provide shear dependent viscosity. It also provides that mucoadhesive and mucomimetic properties, while biochemical properties would allow it to have ocular surface restoration through CD4 for binding and free radical scavenging. So sodium hyaluronate acts as both the drug as well as a medical device in management of dry eye disease. It has a long-lasting retention and mucoadhesive property. It creates a thick coating and which prevents water evaporation. So it can also be used in evaporative dry eye as well as aqueous deficiency dry eye. HA also shows significantly greater increase in non-invasive breakup time compared to HPMC. This can be combined with CMC and sometimes with trehalose also. Trehalose not only protects the cells from desiccation, but also preserves the cell membrane and membrane proteins from deactivation or denaturing during desiccation, thus protecting cells from death by desiccation. This is a new kid on the block. It prevents corneal epithelial cells and death from desiccation. So only I think the last slide and maybe a concluding slide. Hence, trehalose and HA tear substitute significantly decreases ocular discomfort symptoms, surface damage, and tear cytokine levels along with goblet cell density recovery. These results may be associated with the synergic action of both trehalose and HA in targeting different entries of the dry eye disease vicious circle. And the last but not the least, the rebamipide, which also is a good option for managing the dry eye, having, mucin deficiency. So the take-home message would be determine which cure film layer is primarily involved. For evaporative dry eye, lubricants containing PEG or PG with HP Gore are effective. Can also try HA containing drops. For aqueous deficient dry eye, drops with CMC with osmoprotectants may be preferred. In both these conditions, trehalose can also be effective, though I do not have very personal experience of using trehalose for a long term. In ocular surface issues or where there is mucin deficiency, rebamipide is a useful adjunct. With this, I would just like to thank everyone for the attention.
Thank you, Paras. And we move on to Sujata, our last speaker, who will tell us about life beyond ocular lubricants for dry eye patients.
Thank you, Kuresh. At the outset, I'd like to thank Centis Pharma and the organizers for giving me this opportunity. You can see my slides?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, thank you. So my topic is on dry eye management, which is beyond lubricants. So we all know that dry eye is a multifactorial misery with unhappy patients, a frustrated physician, and a growing prevalence, particularly because of the digital world. There are a lot of comorbidities which has been discussed, the history and the need for other experts in this field. Now I'm going to take mainly the MGD, which is probably the leading cause of dry eye, and look at the role of other factors which can help in patients with MGD. MGD is very important because it reduces ocular health and protection. It has its effects on corneal health, conjunctival health, tear film immunity, visual acuity, ocular discomfort, and contact lens discomfort. So looking at the pathophysiology of MGD, there's a thickening of the mebum, sloughing of the cells within the glans, reduced mebum secretion and blocked ducts, inflammation of the eyelids, and bacterial proliferation and contamination of the healthy tear film with toxins. So this is a pathophysiology and the sequence of events which can happen in an evaporative dry eye. So normally the home remedy would be to give them a warm compress and artificial tears with gels and ointment. In patients with slightly advanced disease, you can try out anti-inflammatory drugs like steroids and cyclosporin. And patients who have other causes, you can try punctal plugs, omega-3 fatty acids, and doxycycline. So looking a little bit at the punctal plugs, there can be two types, the temporary or the dissolving plugs. Normally we use a cat gut, which is a biodegradable material, and these plugs can last for an eye from probably a few days to a few weeks. Why does it help? Because then we know how the patient feels. Is he comfortable having a plug in the eye? And whether there's a lot of watering. Some patients can complain of a lot of watering in the eye and they're not very comfortable. So it gives us a trial period to know whether they'll be happy with the permanent plug. So these permanent plugs are longer lasting medical plastic devices which are made of silicone and acrylic. I'm not going to the details of this because there are quite a lot of them in the market. And these plugs are designed to stay in the eye for years and inserted into the canaliculus in patients with severe dry eye. Normally, there is no major side effect associated with it. There may be patients who can develop canaliculitis in which these plugs have to be removed. Other than that, if it has not been inserted properly, it can produce irritation on the ocular surface and has to be reinserted. So looking at the newer modalities, I'm going to concentrate mainly on IPL and LipiFlow, which has its role mainly in treatment of evaporative dry eye disease. So the IPL stands for Intense Pulse Light, in which a handheld computer-controlled flash gun is used to deliver an intense, visible, broad spectrum of light. And as you can see here, you can see the application areas over the malar area and over the zygomatic zone. And this is how it's done. The eye is protected, and then following application of gel, the flash gun is kept on the surface, and 5 applications are done on either side. So it contains a high intensity light source which emits a polychromatic light, and it's a visible light from 15 nanometers to the infrared spectrum. That's the reason why we cover our eyes as well. We give protection to our eyes as well. And the treatment area is located inferior to the lower eyelids, and there's no contact directly overlying the meibomian glands. So how does it work in MGD? MGD has abnormal telangiectatic blood vessels which can secrete chronic inflammatory mediators. So this IPL near the lid causes closing of the abnormal blood vessels secreting inflammatory mediators, and thereby decreasing bacterial overgrowth and improving the quality of the tears. So the mode of action is heat transfer, which softens the meibum and aids expression. That's one thing. Thrombosis of the abnormal vasculature, diminishing the local release of inflammatory mediators. Bacterial load on the lid margins and ocular adnexa can be directly affected by the IPL. And lastly, most importantly, stimulates the zygomatic nerve and increases production of meibum and aqueous.
Meibomian gland dysfunction leads to inadequate expression of meibum and consequently a deficient lipid layer with tear film instability and the onset of dry eye. How does the EI work? We start with choosing the desired energy level decided by the skin tone of the patient. It is important to validate the warnings prior to starting the treatment. After putting an eye shield and application of jelly, the treatment involves applying flashes to the zygomatic region, 5 on each side. Our hypothesis is that this increases the secretion of meibum and aqueous by stimulation of a parallel pathway involving the zygomatic nerve, which increases the parasympathetic outflow to the meibomian and lacrimal glands. Eventually, meibomian gland expression causes restoration of the lipid layer and reduced dryness.
So this is just a very interesting video which shows how this IPL works, and since already it has been discussed, I just want to go into the exclusion criteria. These are some of the exclusion criteria where the patient has very dark skin or active allergies, precancerous lesions, HSV, keratitis, lupus. All these are some of the contraindications where IPL cannot be done. And the main important thing is the recommended application is on 0, 15, 45 days and optionally on 75 days. So I'm just going to discuss some of the trials which have been done in intense pulse ride. This is probably one of the first, which shows that the non-invasive tear breakup time increased from the baseline at day 45 in the treated eye, but not in the control eye. So this was a prospective study done in 3 centers using 62 eyes of 31 patients. And they showed all parameters showed a statistically significant improvement. And the parameters they took into control was the interferometry, T-BAT, CFS, meibomian grade, lid margin abnormalities, etc. So coming to LipiFlow, it's a totally different technology which uses a vector thermal pulse technology. It consists of a console and a single-use sterile device, the activator, and is a drug-free mechanism of action. So the mechanism here is again delivering heat and a therapeutic motion with regulated sensors. So basically it produces compression of the eyelids and expresses open the blockages in the meibomian glands. The obstructed meibum is liquefied and expressed out of the glands and resumes producing and delivering the essential oil needed for the healthy tear film. So looking at this picture, you can see that it's gotten first on the external side, it has an eye cup, which constantly, intermittently applies pressure to the lids. So which has got an inflatable air bladder, so that it goes up and down. And inside it has got a lid warmer. So it keeps warming up the lids, particularly the meibomian glands. But at the same time, it walls over the cornea, so there is no direct heat applied on the cornea. So the heat facilitates the release of the secretion from the obstructed meibomian glands. So this is how the console looks. And these are some of the trials which have undergone this, showing the sustained effect of a single dose of vector thermal pulsation of meibomian gland dysfunction, evaporative dry eye, in which they included 200 subject of 4 lid eyes who were randomized to a single VTP treatment once daily, twice daily, or 3 months, and conventional warm compress and lid hygiene. So at 3 months, the treatment group had a better mean improvement in meibomian gland score and dry eye symptoms compared to the controls. And not only that, over a period of 12 months, they showed the same response. So when you look at the restoration of meibomian gland function, the significant improvement in meibomian glands was seen in this study as well. Am I exceeding my time?
Yeah.
I think
you need to wind up.
Yeah. Okay. So this is again a study which showed the effect. So Tixel is something, a new non-radiation technology, which has a lot of benefits, which due to lack of time, I'm just winding up. So the caveats are evaporative dry eye is probably the most common cause of dry eye, and lubrication alone may not be sufficient in these patients. Thank you.
Thank you, Sujata. I think we have covered quite the gamut. We now will move on to just answering the questions asked by our glaucoma colleagues. And I'd ask each of you how you would tackle this, because it's very common. Patients of glaucoma who got SPKs and staining and irritation because of the long-standing glaucoma drops. Sujata, starting with you, how would you manage these patients?
First, I would discontinue all the drops, all the anti-glaucoma medication, and put them only on lubricants. Preservative-free medication would be my first choice, and particularly BAK-free lubricants. And then give it 1 week, 2 weeks, and then look for which start introducing the drops one by one. Now we are getting preservative-free anti-glaucoma medications. So I would probably start with the prostaglandin analog, which is applied once a day, and it can be applied at night, and with preservative-free drops.
Okay, so at least a window period of a couple of weeks where you don't use the anti-glaucoma. Paras, you want to add anything to this?
I would like to consult the glaucoma consultant and decide which anti-glaucoma drugs can be discontinued right away. And I would like to add preservative-free medication so that most of the epithelial damage can be taken care of by that. Sometimes that helps a lot.
Okay, Hijab?
Yeah, only in addition, maybe depending on the severity of the glaucoma, I would just add Diamox orally.
Yes. Yeah, I think all of us would add Diamox in that window period. Hitendra?
Yes, sir, I agree to that. Basically, the mainstay would be to take off the patient from the drops on which he is.
Correct. And okay. I think we've had an excellent combined session of glaucoma and dry eye. And since time is running out, I'll hand it over to Ruchi to conclude the session.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, Dr. Muscati. Thank you, Dr. Hirsch, for moderating the session so well. And thank you very much, Mr. Deepak Bhari, for being here. Thank you very much, Dr. Hitendra, Dr. Sujata, Dr. Paras, Dr. Hijab, Dr. Manisha, and Dr. Pratik Vyas for here. I'm so happy to have this Senti session, and I'm sure we will try to speak to our AIOC if we get the recordings, and we'll share it with the learning students furthermore, how they can really assess these controversies and take a decision in glaucoma and dry eye. Thank you very much, and have a Sunday, pleasant Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.